Okay, so I'll just give a brief introduction of Laurie G. Beaman. Prof. Laurie G. Beaman is internationally recognized for three core intellectual innovations. The first one, the concept of equality as an alternative to tolerance and accommodation and responding to religious diversity. The second one, the identification of the transformation of majoritarian into culture and heritage, urging will to religion and its impact on the growing category of those who choose no religion. Since 2006, she has been a professor and Canada Research Chair in Religious Diversity and Social Change at the University of Ottawa in the Department of Classics. Without much ado, let me hand over to you, Prof. Beaman.
Thanks so much, Manny. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Some of you are here kind of by force. Those would be the members of the research team, Repairing Sociality. Some of you have actually come voluntarily, so thank you for that. I'm looking forward to exchanging with you. And then there is a group online, and I'd like the group online to be aware that I can't see you. You're not up on any screen where I can view you or see your name. So I did have a quick peek before we started, and that's it. I might run over to Guillerme's screen and take a look in the middle of this. We never know. The other thing I would say is I'm dealing with an iPad with my slides because I have presentation notes that deal with numbered slides. So that's in front of me. And then behind me, I have a fancier screen with the slides that everyone can see. So if I sort of look like I'm a little bit disoriented, I am partly because of jet lag, but also because I'm doing multi-technology things, which I'm not good with one, never mind two or three at the same time. The other thing is it's a master class. So the way I teach is I don't like to lecture. I like to interact. So I'll just forewarn you of that. There'll sort of be some prompts where I'll ask questions and I'll hope that you might participate and that you might answer the questions. And if you don't, I'd like you to know in advance that I'm very comfortable with painful silence. It's a teaching technique. I am. So without further ado, I'm here to talk about deep equality. And the disadvantage of this particular setting is that I have team members who have been working a bit with deep equality. We're just starting to work with it. I have some people who I think have pretty much no knowledge of what the heck it is I'm talking about when I talk about deep equality. And then I have some people on screen, particularly those in Brazil, who have been working with Guilherme in a class, and they've been exploring deep equality in Brazil. So there are multiple levels of knowledge. So I hope that I hit a note where there's something for everyone in this particular talk. First of all, then, I'm going to try to make that work. There, I did. So we live in diverse societies. That's where we begin. And I'm from Canada, and Canada, you know, land of multiculturalism and all of that. And so I've been thinking about diversity for quite a long time. I had a research project called Religion and Diversity, and much of my professional life is focused on religion, but not exclusively. So deep equality was developed in the context of that project. So really was focusing on religious diversity along with non-religious people. But we all live in diverse societies: Canada, South Africa, Brazil, Wales, the UK. That diversity looks quite different in all of these places. But hopefully we can find some spaces of commonality as we think about the idea of managing diversity. And I'll challenge that in a minute. So the question that I have been preoccupied with has been, how do we live well together in a diverse society? So the argument I made was that public space is riddled with negative stories about religion and difference, and it's not just religion, but as I said, this was developed in the context of religion, and religion and difference that play on themes of conflict, diversity, demands for accommodation, and so on. And such stories reflect the challenges of living in diverse societies. These challenges are experienced at the interpersonal, the group, and the institutional levels. And the core project of late modern societies has become to manage and respond to this troublesome diversity. And for each of us in our countries, the troublesome part has its own context. And I'm quite aware that the context in South Africa is rather different than the context in Canada. As I said, hopefully we'll find some spaces where we can think together on this. So there are news stories, public discourse, all focusing on a lot of negativity, accommodation, toleration, tolerance, and so on. So as I mentioned, I was managing, leading a project called Religion and Diversity. And that was happening about the same time. So there was a lot of talk in Canada around the notion of tolerance and accommodation. And we had what was known as the Bouchard-Taylor Commission Report. The Taylor in Bouchard-Taylor is Charles Taylor, who was a rather well-known philosopher and social theorist. So that Taylor was part of that commission. And the Bouchard-Taylor Commission Report came out in 2008. So what they did was they went around the province of Quebec, and they were really focused on cultural and religious differences. And there were a number of recommendations that came from that report and so on. So I'm working in that context. And Bouchard and Taylor start talking about, when people have difference, they should just basically get along. And they developed this concept called concerted adjustment. And as I was listening to the discourse of tolerance and accommodation and concerted adjustment, first of all, I thought there's something seriously wrong when the best we can do is tolerance and accommodation. Mm-hmm. And the other thing that bothered me specifically about the Bouchard-Taylor Commission report was this idea of concerted adjustment, as though people didn't already find ways to get along and to work things out, because they did. Not always, but they did. And they had gone around Quebec and they had heard stories from around Quebec. Most of the stories in the news were negative stories, but there were some positive stories as well. So here's my first question for you. What's wrong with tolerance and accommodation? How does that feel if I say I tolerate you? Anyone want to say anything?
Putting up.
Putting up with you? Yeah, putting up with you. Anything else come to mind? How does it make your belly feel? I'm going to tolerate you.
Not good.
No, kind of icky. Okay. Accommodation. Sort of the same thing. How can I accommodate your need? I get to say how I accommodate. So this was language that really troubled me. And now my slide. So the concepts of tolerance and accommodation perpetuate hierarchy of us tolerating them. So there's always an us and a them, an othering, a hierarchy. It's always, we are going to accommodate you. And that was very much some of the discourse around accommodation and tolerance. Welcome. So I started thinking about what was wrong with it. I'm trained also as a sorry, I forgot I had this angle right there. I'm trained as a jurist, and I worked a lot in law and thinking about law. And the idea of reasonable accommodation starts in law, and then it starts to circulate. And it starts to circulate outside of law in public discourse. So how do we accommodate minorities? How do we, they are asking for this. So how do we accommodate minorities? So I started to think about what was wrong with that. And law certainly didn't seem to have the solutions. There are top-down solutions. Law is important. Constitutional guarantees are important. But it seemed to me there was something else happening on the ground. So as social scientists, I'm also trained as a sociologist. It also seemed to me that we're really, really good about doing power analysis, conflict analysis, but maybe not so good at thinking beyond that and looking at the ways that people find to work out conflict in everyday life. And the ways that maybe there's not conflict, they just find ways to get along, to live well together, as I have put it in some of my work. So, excuse me while I do my magic again here. So It seemed to me, as I said, that on the ground in everyday life, people were sorting out difference, finding spaces of similarity in creative, spontaneous, and often unnoticed ways. Equality was embedded in everyday actions, not in law, which has a rather narrow, most often formal conceptualization of equality that tends to emphasize sameness. There is nuance in law, but I'm sort of glossing over that admittedly. So some of the moments that I was thinking about, those everyday moments, I came to think of those moments as non-events, the ways in which we might spontaneously have a moment with someone in the grocery store, on the bus, simply a way to acknowledge our common humanity, maybe with some humor. And it struck me that those moments are really important. And here I have a number of influences in this work, and I'll get to those in a minute. But one that seemed to me particularly lovely was the work of British sociologist Les Bath, who called these moments pearls. And he argued that as social scientists, we have lost the ability to see the pearls, to sort out the pearls, and to actually listen to what people listen and watch what people are doing. So that was one of the influences on me. I thought the pearl was a lovely image as I thought about religious diversity and living well, and other kinds of diversity as well. There are, of course, stories of conflict and even hatred. We know that. But why did those overshadow the stories of compassion, caring, even love, which is not a word we use often in the academy? And I most often, as I said, situate myself as a sociologist, but often I situate myself as a sociologist in a critical tradition. So this was a kind of revelation for me to think about it in this way. And I found myself reflecting on the imbalance we are left with if we don't think about what works as well as what doesn't work. And we know there's lots that doesn't work, but maybe there are some things that do work that we ought to pay attention to. So I started thinking about this in terms of equality, because I had been really quite bothered about the way that law had commandeered equality, and we were not talking about equality in day-to-day, everyday discourse. So after a lot of reflection, I started situating this more in the realm of equality. So here's another one of those painful moments. What does equality mean? When you hear the word equality, what do you think?
Even.
Even? Okay.
Fairness.
Fair.
Okay, sorry. Fair, I had like clanking door. Fair. Fairness. Yes, fairness. Even? Any other words? Equality.
Lack of hierarchy.
Lack of
Hierarchy.
hierarchy. Thank you, Christy. Okay. Fairness, equality, lack of fairness, lack of hierarchy. Sorry. All right. Those are some of the things that I started to thinking about in terms of everyday interactions. So that one. So what is deep equality? It's a call to reformulate the focus from diversity as a problem to thinking about diversity as an opportunity. It's an invitation to explore the ways in which people work out differences in day-to-day life. I lost the definition. So, deep equality, it's not a legal policy or social prescription. It's not achievable by a magic formula that can be enshrined in human rights codes. Human rights codes may help, but it's a process enacted and owned by so-called ordinary people in everyday life. Deep equality is a vision of equality that transcends law, politics, and social policy, and that relocates equality as a process rather than a definition, and as lived rather than prescribed. It recognizes equality as an achievement of day-to-day interaction and is traceable through agonistic respect. We'll come back to agonistic respect, recognition of similarity, and a simultaneous acceptance of difference, creation of community, and neighborliness. It circulates through micro-processes of individual action and inaction and through group demonstrations of caring. Remember the micro-processes, and I mentioned the non-event, that's what I'm thinking about. It's not the language or process of tolerance or accommodation. I've already made that clear, I think. It recurs, circulates, reshapes, and reframes, and thus forms part of the bedrock of social life. By retelling and exploring stories of negotiation, without the word navigation, it's possible to shift our social imaginary to better facilitate what works. And what works varies from place to place and time to time. And I think that's really important. We're dealing with different social contexts, different diversities, and different histories. And so we need to think about that in the context of this particular idea. So how did I get myself here? I can assure you that it was many, many rabbit holes, many different directions, different kinds of reading, different kinds of thinking. And I've got a couple, I've missed something on this slide though. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the history for me of what this looked like as I started to think about these things. And this was a long process. The process of thinking about getting to this place was long. I would be on a train. Don't ever sit beside me on a train, by the way, because it's just a bad idea. I'd be on a train and I'd be speaking with someone and they say, "What do you do?" So I talked to them, and then one woman I sat beside, we ended up talking about her entire childhood history, where she identified as an atheist, and she did as a child as well. But she recounted the story of helping her Catholic friend with her catechism. And I didn't think that I should be. Thank you. So there were a lot of rabbit holes. First, existing studies. So I also tend to move around. I'm like, it's hard for me to just stand here. I wanted to walk and talk. So first, existing studies. So if you want to study something called deep equality, which you've just made up, first of all, you can't go out and interview people and say, "So have you experienced deep equality?" But as I'm speaking, I would really like it if you would think about, are there some of these moments I can think of? Maybe even on your way to campus today, wherever you are online. Maybe there was a moment where you had a nice exchange with someone who was a stranger, just a brief exchange or a brief moment of caring. Someone helped you, you drop something, they pick it up, whatever. Just think about that as I'm speaking. So what I did do though, was I started to think about some of the research I'd already been involved in. And that gave me data sets, if you will. I'm a sociologist after all. First were the 900 submissions to the Bouchard-Taylor Commission. Now, remember I told you that the commission had gone around the province of Quebec to hear people's stories about cultural difference. Most of the stories, as I said, that made the news were negative. But I had access to all of those submissions. I was working with a Quebec scholar at the University of Montreal. Her name is Solange Lefebvre. So I had access to those studies, and we analyzed those submissions, we analyzed those submissions for kind of vignettes, stories of deep equality. I'd also worked with Peter Beyer, who's done a lot of work on globalization. So some of you may know his work. We had done research with 500 youth looking at the idea of religious diversity and migrant youth and their experiences of religion. So I looked at those interviews again. We had not asked questions about equality, diversity, as I said, deep equality, and so on. We had not asked questions about those. I also worked with interviews that I had done with two researchers. One is Jennifer Selby at Memorial University. The other is Emily Barra, and she's at York University. And we had done 50 interviews with Muslims. And then finally, in the data set, I examined legal cases. And one of those cases makes it to a chapter in a book that I wrote on deep equality. And that was the case of a young Sikh boy who wanted to wear his kirpan, his ceremonial knife, to school, and in fact did wear his knife to school until things went rather awry. One day he was on the playground and it fell out. And well, I don't have time to go into it, but that created a bit of a catastrophe brouhaha that ended somewhat well. It was a case that went all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada, and in the end, the Supreme Court decided that Mr. Multani could wear his kirpan to school. I'm giving you the very short version of that story. So those were the data sets that I used, looking at existing interviews and thinking about what might it mean to look at these with a different lens other than the original lens that we had intended. I also looked at what I call cultural artifacts. So movies like Bottle in the Gaza Sea, books, Birds Without Wings by Louis de Bernier, which is a book on a particular time period in Turkey. And I also was really quite struck by the work of William Kentridge, who's a South African artist who does a lot of animation work. And he had a particular film called Tide Table that was done in 2003. And I went to the Museum of Contemporary Art in Montreal, and I happened to see this by chance. I had a friend who was an animator, and he said, go to the museum and see this. And I was like, I don't really like animation. And I went, and I couldn't take my eyes off Kentridge's work. It was amazing. He was an anti-apartheid activist as an artist, and I went back a number of times to see that particular film and his other animation work, but that film in particular was really striking. And it seemed to me that I started putting on what I call deep equality lenses, trying to find these moments, non-events, sometimes organized events, more organized events, and I'll talk about one of those in a second. I have to pull up my lost PowerPoint slide now. The other area, so I had data, cultural artifacts, some theorists, and adjacent scholarship. So I already mentioned Les Back. I also was interested in the whole notion of competition and cooperation. And the dominant narrative is one of, competition in our societies. But I was really interested in cooperation. And of course, some of the work of Charles Darwin was influential in this, because Darwin actually argued that collaboration and cooperation is as common in nature as competition. I looked at game theory. Believe me, if there's anything that's way outside my realms of expertise, it's game theory. But they also were really focused on cooperation and the value of cooperation and the frequency of cooperation. So I found that also useful. Gordon Allport's work, he was writing in the 50s, and I came across this thing called contact theory. And Allport was really interested in discrimination, and he argued that the more people at discrimination and prejudice, and he argued that the more people who are different come into contact with each other, the more likely they are able to overcome prejudice. There are some caveats to that, but I'm not going to cover those just at the moment. I was also influenced. I was frequently invited to groups who were talking about education about religion in schools. And I have some concerns about that, mostly about the identity corners that people get pushed into. Oh, you're the Muslim, you're the Christian. Here's what Christians do. Here's what Muslims do. Here's what Sikhs do. So I have some concerns about that. But the people who were having these conversations kept inviting me back. So I guess they thought that I was gentle enough in the expression of those that I was worth having in the room. And I came across the work of Redco, which is a group based in the UK, and from Weiss. And they had done studies with students in 8 countries in Europe. And they asked students, how do you think people who are different can get along? And the students said, by doing things together. So it struck me that there was something we could learn from everyday life in the ways in which people are doing things together. So, deep equality, coming back to it, I've argued that deep equality is a non-legal formulation of equality that looks into the everyday actions of people as foundational to living well together. It includes cooperation, agonistic respect. I know I promised I'm coming back to it, and I will. Generosity, negotiation, forgiveness, contaminated diversity, immanence, similarity, humor. Humor's big. Discomfort, neighborliness, and love. It's located between sameness and difference in the mutual recognition of similarities. And I argue that the ability to imagine oneself in relation to others and what one has in common with others is key to navigating difference. So I want to show you, it's a story from the Bouchard. This is one of these examples of the pieces of evidence that I excavated from the Bouchard-Taylor Commission submissions from people all around. These are mostly, if you can call them, ordinary people. And this is the story of Arlene and Fatima. Did that? There. Arlene and Fatima. Let's see. Maybe I'll go over here. If I can. Doesn't disrupt something. So this is Arlene. And she's describing, no, this is Fatima we begin with. So they're on the balcony in Montreal, and it's a summer evening. And Fatima says, it's a sin for us to drink wine, Fatima says in a neutral voice. This is Arlene's submission, so Arlene is writing this. Fatima's my neighbor. We're having a friendly chat, each from our balconies in the same building, like neighbors in urban centers all over the world. I'm enjoying salad with cold cuts and dried fruit, accompanied by a glass of wine during a magnificent summer evening. I'm also enjoying Fatima's company and that of her 5-year-old son, who has just innocently asked me, are you drinking apple juice? Should I lie? Not in a million years, but I also don't think it's necessary to tell him that I'm eating cold roast pork. Even if Fatima's comment is not accusatory, at first I find it strange that she would make it. Knowing me, she must know that I know the drinking of alcohol is forbidden in her religion. But after thinking about it, I realized that the comment was directed to her son as a teaching moment. For the next few days, I pay attention to her behavior and that of her kids in order to see if I can detect a bit of estrangement. There is none. There are differences between us that are not relevant to our relationship, and thus it's not worth talking about them. What we have in common weighs far more than those points, and we don't want to throw the baby and the bathwater over the balcony. So it's a kind of innocuous story, but it seemed to me it got at some of the things I was interested in around deep equality. There's a little bit of discomfort there. There's maybe a little bit of a moment. Arlene is assessing the situation. Fatima uses her as a teaching moment. Arlene goes, what the heck? I'm not going to pitch the whole relationship out. So there's a bit of discomfort in this, but there's also a kind of resolution. And those were the kinds of stories. I mean, I have tons of these stories. Some of them are in the book, and some of them I've talked about or used in other contexts. But I just wanted to give you an example of one of the sorts of things that I was looking at when I was looking for these stories. My iPad keeps closing. Sorry about that. Now it won't let me open it. Okay. All right, towards deep equality. So here we have agonistic respect. So there's the idea of agonistic respect, and I'll talk about that in a moment, but the ethos of engagement, which requires letting go of the idea that there is one truth or one right way. Another way to talk about this is relinquishing rightness. And this may be a deliberate strategy, as I said, or it may be something that's more fleeting, just in the moment. Recognition of similarity. So we have difference and sameness. So the recognition of similarities is a focus on shared experience and social relations rather than the erasure of difference or rigid interpretations of identity. And I can talk a little bit more about identity rigidity, but I think it's one of the things that potentially it thwarts deep equality when you imagine people as only being one thing. You are this, you are that, you are Christian, you are Muslim, you are white, you are Black. And there's no sort of possibility of you're a student, you love music, and so on. Sharing spaces equals a reimagining of democratic spaces of equality rather than established hierarchies. And then finally, mapping success stories, using tools of social sciences and humanities to tell stories of people working things out. And I think that was sort of the main goal. That was the piece that I realized, that these stories remain hidden. And so it's really important to talk about telling the stories and recounting the stories, because we don't have a lot of models for thinking about, well, how do we live well together? there's a lot on conflict, but not so much on how might we layer. And Jeremy, I really appreciate the way that you are talking about this. It's adding a complexity to our already very important stories of conflict and power relations, but that there is another layer that needs to be explored. It's not saying we shouldn't be conflict theorists and we shouldn't think about power, not at all. It's saying, let's add another layer to make the analysis a bit more complicated. So here we go, agonistic respect. This is an idea that came from American political theorist William Conley. He develops this idea in his work on deep pluralism. And pluralism is another idea that is fraught, and Conley has tried to rescue it and arguing that we can still use the idea of pluralism in political theory. And that's a debate that political theorists have primarily had, so I'm not going to spend much time on it right now. But woven through the many stories I've analyzed is the practice of agonistic respect. And respect is agonistic because it requires an abandonment of rightness and the conviction that one is imbued with truth through some sort of transcendent authority. Now that reference to transcendent authority was obviously made in reference to when I was thinking about religious people and non-religious people getting along. Conley is often in dialogue with Charles Taylor. Conley doesn't, I think, overtly identify as non-religious, but I'm quite sure that he is. And Taylor, of course, situates himself fully in thinking that fullness is only possible through a connection to the transcendent. Anyhow, that's agonistic respect. So that's one of the pieces, the recognition of similarity, and we'll just go back. So agonistic respect, the recognition of similarity. Moving back past Conley again. So between difference and sameness is similarity. And again, we have to be careful in this not to lapse into sameness, because sameness erases important differences. It also can erase histories of oppression and prejudice and discrimination. So we need to situate ourselves in that space of similarity, always keeping those histories in tension with the idea of similarity. It's through these brief moments of exchange, sometimes brief moments of exchange, rightness and truth lose ground to similarity, shared experiences, shared goals. One of the spaces I've looked at in different contexts is what we call world repairing work. People who enter into and engage in projects together in order to repair the world. And I'm excited in particular about the South African piece of this project that we're all engaged in, repairing sociality, because Howick will be, I don't think it's a secret, is it, Christy? Can I say that how the community of Howick will be one focus of what we're doing, because we're really interested in thinking about some of these ideas in relation to a particular community and the ways in which people world repair together, people collaborate together. Just looking, sorry. Some of the limitations or the possibilities of thwarting this focus are identity corners, identity rigidity, as I said, labeling people in one particular way, you're this or you're that, our sort of desire for purity and categories of purity, the ways in which we push people into you are this, you are that, and we want those categories to be clean and pure. And here's where I borrowed from the work of Anna Singh and the idea of contaminated diversity, which is a way in which we challenge that purity idea to talk about. Chris Miller, who I'm lucky enough to work with on the Canadian project, and last week he identified a kind of contaminated diversity element of one of our case studies, and that was the fact that some Canadians at a particular time period had gone across the US border to give birth because it was the closest hospital. And so those Canadians also had American citizenship, which immediately kind of complicates the idea of Canadian, American, and border. So that is also one of the sort of pieces of this, is thinking about the ways in which we create these identity categories. I've already talked about the risks, sameness, erasing difference, and colonizing, so I'm not going to go over those again. So go back again. So we have recognition, sharing spaces as equals, and I'll just do a quick recounting of the story of the Quebec soccer team These are headlines. Quebec soccer team wears turbans to protest ban and support Sikh players. This was at a time when someone in their wisdom in Quebec Ministry of Sport decided that turbans should not be allowed on the soccer field. And the Brossard soccer team had no Sikh players. They were young, they were boys, 14 and under. But the players said, this is ridiculous. We all love soccer. And so they went to the local Gurdwara. They talked to religious leaders and said, we'd really like to wear turbans at our next game. And as I said, none of them were Sikh. Didn't matter, but they wanted a way to express their solidarity with those players who were being impacted, and that's what they did. They in the end wore the turbans, and the coach on the opposite side said to their coach, this isn't reasonable accommodation. So you can kind of get a sense of where I get my objection to the notion of accommodation, because it was quite clear that this was really an equality move. Okay. So the idea is to shift the focus from law, from conflict, to everyday equality, to cooperation. And it's also to think about, how do these stories make a difference? I'm trying to catch my notes up in my slides. Yeah. So the power of the story. What shape do these stories take? Sometimes they're brief vignettes describing interactions between people who do not know each other. Sometimes they emerge from ongoing relationships. They take place between neighbors in the context of a commercial transaction. As I said, maybe on your way here on the bus, perhaps in a store, between co-workers, between service providers and their clients. They reflect a constellation of values and preconditions, most important of which is respect, our respect and the willingness to emphasize similarity rather than difference. So how might small stories of deep equality help to provide insight into social futures? What are the existing structural supports that facilitate deep equality, and what are the obstacles to deep equality? And I've mentioned a couple of those already. Those are some of the questions that I'm asking myself. Sorry, trying to again navigate my slides on my. So, where can this lead? Narratives of negotiation of difference can open space for deeper collaboration to address pressing social concerns. And I used climate change in this slide, but that's sort of not where I am in this particular talk. Living well together, we can possibly extend it to human, non-human animal relations, following Indigenous practices. And here again, I'm speaking from a Canadian perspective. Equality is reconceptualized as residing outside of law and not formal equality suggested by sameness. So what's our quest? Our quest is to empirically map deep equality, bring it into conversation with democracy. And when I talk about our quest, I'm talking specifically about the project that the team I'm working with is engaged in, pardon me. So we are sharing a commitment to, excavating these stories, narratives, and activities that transcend difference, rather than focusing on a clash of civilizations, for example, or social conflict, and without erasing disadvantage, power relations, and discrimination. We seek to recover, map, identify, and excavate the ways that people work together. So what are the social processes by which they overcome differences that may have historically prevented collaboration and cooperation? What are the obstacles they've encountered? How did they overcome them? What are their vulnerabilities? What remains unsettled or unsolved? And what are potential points of fracture? And then, so we want to bring this into conversation with democracy and the idea of democracy. So in other words, all of these little interactions, and maybe some bigger ones, how do they contribute to democracy? And how do they contribute to our understanding perhaps of everyday democracy? That's an outstanding question. I don't have the answers to that. That's why we're working as a team with a multi-country study in order to hopefully be able to answer some of these questions. And then finally, for me, a challenge that I'm particularly interested at the moment is bringing this into conversation with the notion of Ubuntu. And I am such a baby scholar when it comes to Ubuntu, so I'm learning from my colleagues as we go and trying to sort out. I think Ubuntu is a philosophy, a normative philosophy, whereas deep equality is really a mapping of social life. But the two, I think, may be able to speak to each other in maybe, I hope, some important and interesting ways. But first, for me, I need to be able to better understand Ubuntu. And right now, I'm not feeling like I'm understanding it well enough to be able to do that kind of analysis that hopefully we will engage in as a group together. The other thing that I'm preoccupied with is thinking about how to empirically study deep equality. In other words, it may seem to you that I've done that already in part, but I'm now looking at it from the other end. If we think about what do we want to, what are the measurables? Well, it sounds a bit positivistic. When we're thinking about deep equality, how do we identify it? How do we position it in relation to case studies? And so we've introduced a couple of Canadian case studies that we'll bring to the table as we think about deep equality. But those are that's the sort of, I hope that did the Deep Equality 101, Christy, that you were hoping for, at least the basics. And then this leads us into thinking about how do we use this idea, or do we use this idea, as Guilherme says, it's an analytical concept, it's not a normative framework, and I think that's a perfect way to position it. It's a way to think about and draw attention to those everyday interactions that we do all the time, but don't necessarily think about. And maybe it draws our attention to thinking about how is it that we create something, to use Christy's words, how is it that non-events build into a kind of social fabric that allows us to perhaps work together when we face a situation that requires world repairing, or a situation that requires some kind of action. In the New Brunswick, I'll just mention the New Brunswick case study, which is the province that I'm from, a group of citizens who had typically not necessarily worked together, who included Indigenous people, Francophones, Anglophones, the elderly, youth, came together to oppose an extraction, a harmful, environmentally harmful extraction method. And so we're using that as a case study, and we're thinking about how do these people come to work together? What are the ways in which they talk to each other? How do they talk about each other? As a way to think about, is deep equality a useful tool in thinking about all of this? So I'm going to end there so that maybe we can have some conversation. And I'm hoping that maybe you had a recognition of deep equality in your life that you might want to confess. But if not, that's okay too. You can just end there and we can have conversation, questions, what have you. So thank you very much. Questions, comments, exhaustion?
We can start with something. I'm thinking in your narrative. Sometimes I feel that deep equality is a moment, it's a situation, it's something that happens, and sometimes I think that it's a concept. How you differentiate these two senses of the world?
Yeah, Paula, thank you. And I'm still kind of navigating that, to be honest with you. Because as a concept, it's an idea, something we should maybe think about, look for, define. And then on the other hand, it's also something that's a practice in life, and sort of looking for that practice in life. So I don't know if I can even answer you adequately when I say that. I'm actually still working through that and thinking about how do we does it need to be one or the other, or can it be both? And I'm not sure, to be honest. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this detailed discussion. I'll just ask a hypothetical question.
Oh, no. Another one.
Assuming that you were to give advice to any nation, not just a Canadian society, any nation, if we were to advise them on how to embrace deep equality, giving two options: one, to have it being state engineered, and to have it coming voluntarily from the citizenry, which option would you go for?
Well, that's just, you can have your cake and eat it too, Becky. I don't think you can enshrine deep equality in some kind of state program. I think it's really a recognition of everyday realities, and that really what I would say to a state is you need to pay attention to the ways that people get along. And then you also need to pay attention to the things that you do that thwart or facilitate the ways that people get along, the ways that people live well together. So that would be more, I would more take that tack than say, now to do deep equality, you must do this, 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 and this. Of course, as we know, constitutions, for example, can help facilitate or they can thwart, but constitutions are only written documents. It's also what people do in day-to-day life. So that would be my response. It is not a program. It's really something we need to attend to as social scientists. We need to listen, we need to pay attention to what people do on the ground. And the manifestation of this will look different in different places. Like the South Africa case, I think will look quite different than, the library case, the cross-border library case in Canada, in Quebec and Vermont. These are two different cases, but I think they will speak in important ways to each other. As we think about what does it mean to pay attention to deep equality? What does it mean to pay attention to the ways that people respect each other in day-to-day life, work together in day-to-day life, share projects in day-to-day life, and overcome differences that might, in the abstract or at other periods of time, feel like they are insurmountable, I suppose. So I don't know, but.
And I have a question here from Luciana, is one of the students that has attended the course about deep equality. First of all, she is thanking you for the amazing conference. And her question is, how to think in deep equality in Brazil in a reality of racism, heritage since slavery period, in a reality full of inequalities, poverty, etc.
Yeah. Thank you, Luciana, and thank you for the work that you're doing, because I know a little bit about it, thanks to Beaman. And how to think, so Paula and I have this ongoing debate with each other when we started working on deep equality, and Paula said, there is no deep equality in Brazil. And I was like, yes, there is, there has to be. People do find ways to get along. And I think to answer you, Luciana, I would say we always need to pay attention to these oppressions, these histories, that they're always there. But then we ask questions about, okay, how are people dealing with this? How are people on the ground? How are they navigating it? How are people who identify with these histories, in some senses embody these histories, how do they navigate? What are their experiences? And that's what we attend to, and that's the call to find the pearls in everyday life. We have no right to impose this. I think that the value of this is to pay closer attention to these other narratives beyond and in addition to certainly the histories of oppression and prejudice. We cannot erase those, nor should we. They're really important to keep in mind. And then we ask, okay, how are people themselves handling these? So I hope that answered Luciana's question.
Prof, I think I'll just have a comment of view. And in looking at the aspect of Ubuntu, we should also take into consideration the aspect of affordability and how does the society view those with deep pockets being able to exercise the value of Ubuntu and equality. and those that are viewed as the less fortunate people in society. How is their veil of in exercising equality and Ubuntu as they are seen in the society? Because what is important as a society, we tend to confuse the issue of affordability with Ubuntu and equality, but what we should also look at when we look at the issue of Ubuntu and equality, we should also take into consideration, is the cost noble enough? Is it legit enough? Is it a PR stand, or is it a cause that comes from with legitimacy? How is it that it's dedicated in terms of looking at the character and the principles of the person as well? When you look at Ubuntu, what we should also be a point of contention or point of deposit. How do we value that person? What are the values of the person in the society? Because affordability can cloud the fact of Ubuntu, whereas there is no real gesture in doing and trying to exercise equality and Ubuntu in the society. So we should also take into consideration the issue of affordability and the class of us in people in the society. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that comment. And fortunately, I have some colleagues who are based in South Africa who have, as we've started our conversations about Ubuntu, very much have integrated conversations around class inequality and thinking about Ubuntu, but also asking critical questions about who's using Ubuntu and for what purposes. Is it a politically motivated use, or is there another use? And how does it play out in day-to-day life? So I think your comment is extremely well taken. And you can rest assured that the navigation of Ubuntu does not rest on me. This may comfort you a bit, because as I said, I'm very much a baby scholar in relation to Ubuntu, but I think your point is an extremely important one. And social inequality is at the forefront of what we're thinking about when we're thinking about the South African case study. And I don't know if any of my colleagues want to speak to that. Tawasani, would you say something, please? Then it becomes a conversation, not a monologue, which is great.
I think you were asking about the condition under which Ubuntu, or something that looks like Ubuntu, is performed. Whether it is genuine or it is not. I think that was the idea, to say, well, someone may throw money at other people. I think that was the idea. Is that generosity, or is that a big man syndrome? In Africa, or something called big man syndrome? You spruce up your image by giving money to people that you even despise. If that makes any sense. So there's no generosity there. You can't say that. So if anything, is the opposite of Ubuntu. Remember, Ubuntu is what it is said to be by those who look at you, do what you do. So they can say your deed, your action had Ubuntu in it, or it was devoid of Ubuntu. So I don't think it's something that you can fake, really. It's either really you are performing an event or something that's inspired by Ubuntu, or you are not. And remember, you're not the judge of it. When we get to the phrase Umuntu Mutu Abantu, it's not you who's making that pronouncement. It's other people who are watching. Thank you.
Other comments, questions? Chris, and then Becky, Chris, Becky, Chris.
Thanks. Oh, sorry. A lot of the narratives, I'm thinking of like the quote that you shared, the two women kind of sharing a glass of wine out on their balcony, and a real moment of sociality. Are there any barriers to deep equality that you've seen kind of creep up? We were talking earlier about like the pandemic and kind of coming out of that, and ways the social life has changed, or maybe in different contexts, ways that there isn't space for social collaboration, things like that. Are there any barriers that would prevent deep equality taking place?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Definitely. There are all kinds of barriers, and those are all those things that we analyze around power and hierarchies, all the critical things. I think about, and it's been a long time since I looked at the book, but the Bernier book that I use in my book, and the ways in which the community that de Bernier writes about that's in southern Turkey. He writes about the ways people get along. Sometimes there are Christians and Muslims in this community, and they get along until all the Christians are deported. And Drosola, who is one of the main characters in the book, makes a statement, something to the effect of the people who run the world will never understand what everyday life is really like. And it's one of my favorite quotes in the book, because I think that that's when I answered Becky before, it was to say, are there systemic barriers beyond everyday practices, but are there systemic barriers that states impose that may actually make everyday exchange in this way very difficult? I don't think it's ever impossible, but I think it can be very, very difficult. And I mean, we're even seeing that in the case study that we're using, the library that exists on the border of Vermont and Quebec, and the government to the south of Canada, whose shall remain nameless, has been enforcing the border and shutting things down, and people are finding it more and more difficult to cross. But also there are certain hostilities that are being generated by tariff impositions and so on. So we see practices that may make everyday exchange in this way more difficult. I don't think it's ever impossible, which is why I've had this ongoing, like with Paula, yes, there is deep equality in Brazil, even those things may be difficult.
Yeah, no, hey, what is this thing now? Yeah, no, mine was just to put a footnote on what Thompson was saying. That when you look at Ubuntu, you can look at it in a literal sense or in a figurative sense. Just like we do when somebody has done something good, or somebody can be relied upon. You say, I want this thing, I indoor. Not necessarily meaning that person is a maid. We are looking at the act itself, and then you say what that person did is what real men would do. Similarly, with Ubuntu, if someone has done something good or has been doing things that are right for society, then we say, so and so, I want to law. You basically mean that that person is doing good things to the community. But then in a different context, let's say, for example, look at politicians who normally hand out parcels on the eve of an election, like they will do next year when we have local government election. You can't call that Ubuntu. Like you can't praise a fish for swimming. That's what it's supposed to do anyway. So in other words, I'm just reiterating the point that Ubuntu operates in different contexts. Depending on how it is used, it can then qualify you to Ubuntu, or it can be something else, like in the examples that I'm using. So there are people who have money, and then as a way of showing off, they will pretend to be healthy, and then they will claim the label of using Ubuntu, when in fact they're just boasting, they are showing off, and there is no element of Ubuntu in it. So I think context matters. That's basically the underlying.
Thank you very much. And Laurie, you know more than anyone that I'm very enthusiastic about looking at deep equality as an analytical framework. And while I do that, I always think about the difference between deep equality and the idea of agonistic respect, and the difference between this and the Habermas theory about consensus and so on. But today you talked a little bit about not sameness, but similarity in a sense. Do you think that we can think about consensus in the sense of deep equality and in the sense of this agonistic respect, or consensus would be something that would mean a respect that would not be between between difference, you know. So how do you see the aspect of consensus in the equality?
I actually haven't thought about it a lot, Beaman, so thanks for asking the question. And I was thinking when you asked that question, I'm thinking, and this is maybe a bit unfair because I'm referencing a previous conversation that we had today, but I'm thinking about Christie's comments. I'm thinking about consensus and sort of the ways in which that can be there can be disagreement folded in, and then bringing that back to deep equality and the ways in which people are maybe getting to this place in not such a comfortable way, that there are mistakes, there's forgiveness, and so on. So there's a way in which it's, I mean, I like to leave lots of room in this for not just the happy sunshiny stories, but others that are, you know, Fatima and Arlene, there's a little bit of that, but there are others that are similar in that space of discomfort, if you will, but the ways in which people kind of bring a variety of practices, I suppose. I'm not finding very good words to answer your question. So I think we can keep thinking about consensus, and that there may be a way in which that process of deep equality also folds in consensus in some way or results in consensus, but it's not, I wouldn't say it's a goal. It just might happen. So not a super great answer to your question, I'm sorry, but I will now think about consensus and think, I wish I'd said that, but at the moment, that's the best I can do.
Oh, it's the tech guy again, sorry.
Don't apologize.
Okay, firstly, my comments or my views, I stand to be corrected in some of the aspects, but it's how we learn as humans. I think what we also need to put into consideration when we address equality, we need to also look at the difference in race and how are we as a society are we viewing each other in terms of seeing how are we equal, because we cannot divorce that. Equality is also influenced by the past and the history that we have as a nation. So in cases that you find that people are intimidated by their own color, their own race, and their own capabilities and competencies. So it is very difficult for one to be convinced about equality, but one has not yet divorced that equality does not look at color, race, and everything. So what is important that we need also to educate our society that equality is not measured by color, by race, and everyone. But what is important in equality is the fair representation or the fair opportunity in all the opportunities. And one needs to, when we start to point fingers at the different race, what has been done in our case as a society to grab the opportunity to be in the equal state as the other race. Because we might complain that there is no equality and say that there is no equality in employment, there's no equality in education, there's no equality in social justice. Whereas at the same time, I'm sitting at home, I'm not taking any measures to educate myself, to make myself literate, and I'm also applying for a job, for instance, like to replace Prof, whereas I still have a diploma and say that there's no equality for it. That's the worst case scenario. But we also need to be realistic to ourselves as a society that before we are equal to be viewed as equal, what are we doing in ourselves as a society for personal development? Because equality is also measured how have you capacitated yourself as one, because you cannot ask and cry for equal opportunity whereas you don't have the attributes to fit in that certain aspect of equality. Because equality it's a very broad initiative, it's a very broad perspective, because when you look at equality, you look at how we say we're equal in terms of social justice, economic, mainstream, education, life, and social aspects. Yes, history has does that harshly, but everyone has been given a fair chance to regroup and redeem themselves. But those who feel like, in most cases, those who are feel like they are fitting in a different race or trying to find themselves in the hierarchy of society. They are viewed that they have been selling out in an African context, that you will be a sellout, an ice boy, this political term that I usually use in parliament, an ice boy, a pepper of the people of color and everything, but forgetting that you have basically established yourself as a black person, as a black individual, try to find yourself the right space in the society. So equality, it means us to first address the stigma that as people that we have, as a society that we have. How do we capacitate ourselves to say that I'm equal, to be given an opportunity to replace you, Prof, someday, but I cannot replace you with only having a metric certificate. I need to be realistic to myself and accept myself as an individual to say that equality is applying to everyone. So that's my take with equality, that we need to first look at ourselves, how do we capacitate ourselves, and how do we kill the stigma of race and the difference in the social justice as a person.
So I really appreciate the comment, and I think what you're kind of moving toward too, though, is also that more legal, and thinking about equality in a more legal, in some ways, in a more legal way. I'm talking about it as a sort of enacted process on the ground that people wouldn't even call equality, to be honest with you. This is sort of the sociologist terminology. Where you're focusing too, and this is what I struggled with when I thought about what do I call this thing, is this kind of more systemic notions of equality and the formal. Like this was one of the objections. I wanted to re-own equality because equality had been kind of commandeered by law, and mostly formal notions of equality, i.e., sameness. And then there's the substantive notion of equality, which does recognize systemic disadvantage and attempts to address it, but those still weren't satisfactory. And I thought law just didn't do the job for what it was that interested me. But I think you're also bringing that in, that structural piece of it that we need to think about, and that's the critical piece, I believe, is what you're signaling to us. Signaling to, let's remember hierarchies. Let's remember the structural piece, and I absolutely agree with you. And then I'm saying, okay, as we do that, let's also look at how do people just get along, and then our shared interest as a project is, what does that tell us about democracy, and is there everyday democracy, and so on. But I hear you on the more the structural pieces of equality. And one of the things that fascinated me and also frustrated me in the Canadian context is that in civil society, people don't even talk about equality any longer. They talk about equity. And I don't want to bail on equality just yet. I want to think that maybe it still has some usefulness in civil society as well. But again, that's really context specific. And I think, we might need to have a much longer conversation about the differences between the Canadian context and the South African context. But it's one that I'm really feeling very privileged to be able to even have this conversation today to start to understand that a little bit better. Thank you.
Next. Cheers. I haven't managed to formulate this into a question yet, but it is a question. So thank you.
You can make a statement.
There's a question mark at the end of it, even though it doesn't sound like that. So I'm seeing a lot of tensions within deep equality. So there's this rejection of the accommodation and tolerance framework that comes from the sort of state-led, but I don't see what you're offering to replace that with, because the deep equality is about, you obviously be voluntary with that, but you can't have a state enforcement of everyone has to do deep equality. You're talking about the micro interactions people have with each other in a day-to-day. I'm wondering how we relate that back to what would we have, because we could just get rid of state enforced or state rules or things, but I'm not sort of seeing that thing. And I'm also seeing the sort of same comment on the structural stuff is, we're talking a lot about, there are lots of structural issues that prevent people from doing, or being able to experience any form of equality, if it's deep or not. But we don't really talk about that in this lecture. So how do we relate that again back to the structures? Is the equality analytical framework that you would say, here it is working, and you then look to the structural barriers to that, about structure facilitate stuff that, and then take that as an outcome. So I'm just wondering how we relate this back to from the math, go back to the math. Yeah.
Successful.
That's a question.
Yeah, yeah. I'll see if I can do at least a piece of it justice or even part justice. So tolerance and accommodation, legal formulations. I'm not pretending to tinker with those. I'm sort of given up on that. It seemed to me though that it missed the point. And that was the problem with concerted adjustment as well. So we have these kind of formulas from on high. And the idea of tolerance is, you know, very old. And has been much written about. John Locke, and numerous others talked a lot about tolerance and it is as a solution. And I wasn't really interested in solutions and dictating and coming up with some grand alternative. I was really more interested in, okay, so what do people do every day on the ground? And that was more my interest. So it was really, the situation was, okay, there was all this talk about tolerance and accommodation. And the Multani case in particular was really, I really struggled with that specific chapter of the book that I wrote because and in fact, there's a bit in the Supreme Court decision that talks about reasonable accommodation and sort of expands its scope, which really bugs me, but I can't really speak to that. But what I did speak to in Multani was I had access to interviews that a then younger scholar, he's an emerging scholar, he's now, you know, sort of mid-career, Howie Kislowitz gave me access to his interviews that he had done with people who were involved in the Multani case. And that was fascinating because it was there that I was able to see practices of deep equality. But that doesn't speak to the law and reasonable accommodation and tolerance, but that's not what I'm pretending to do. I'm not really interested in that project. Law will evolve. It will have its own magical formulas about how we ought to. And I mean, I still see the Supreme Court talking about tolerance. I still see cases involving, especially because most of the cases I read are around religious diversity, although I've been spending quite a bit of time with the same-sex marriage reference as well. But they're still using the word tolerance. You'll see in courts, you know, we live in a tolerant society. I'm like, what does that mean? And like my teeth grit, you know, teeth gritted tolerance. But am I pretending to replace it? No. And I'm not really interested in that kind of theorizing. That's what political theorists do. And that's not what I'm wanting to do. I don't know if that answers your question. So if there's a gap or a tension there, it's really that was the inspiration for it. That the language of reasonable accommodation, when it started to jump the leash of law, that's when I started to get concerned. And I started to say, well, let's not talk about, and that may go more to your question, okay, well, what do we put in civil society? And I think that's where we started to see the language of inclusion. Although, you know, I know there are critiques of all of this, but we started to see the language of inclusion, maybe a different version of diversity. But inclusion started to become more of it was, I don't know where it is now. Certainly we could speak about that in the US. In Canada, there hasn't felt like there's a spillover yet. But that was more my concern, and it was not to replace languages, to think about how are people actually talking about this in day-to-day life and what could we learn from that. And we're still learning. So I'm interested in how in our case studies, for example, what's the language that people are using, and is there something we can push to the next step in this, to think about how are people talking in civil society? What is the language that they're using? So I don't know if that got to where you were headed, but that's my thinking process on it.
Yeah, that was good thinking.
Thanks, Nan.
I can come back if there's no more questions. Thank you, this is very good. Is it?
Oh, you put it on?
Oh, I was kind of happy that it wasn't so loud. Yeah, and I really buy that. I really buy the bit where I read your book and you were talking about the sort of escaping of the words of tolerance and reasonable accommodation from like legal aspects into the rest of society. Because I think like law is inherently hierarchical because there's things imposed on us as citizens as a big scary structure, and the idea that its language would escape its bounds and then be used by a football referee or football coach to say, this is going to be no accommodation. I thought that was pretty crazy. So I thought that was a really interesting sort of work discourse that and one that should be resisted. Maybe we shouldn't have these sort of very state and hierarchical terms used to mediate our relationship with each other as just sort of fellow humans. So I really like that one. I had another question that I could ask. You sort of previously said before I asked my first question about how in Canada you don't talk about equality anymore, you talk about equity. So my understanding of that is that equity is meant to sort of supersede equality, because equality is giving everybody 5 hamburgers, but if one person already has 8, they don't need that 5, and the person with no hamburgers maybe needs some more. So that's equity, is giving people the amount that they need based on their resources, and that will supersede equality. But you don't want that. So what am I missing? And yeah, please speak more to why you think we should keep equality in the discourse there. Thanks.
Yeah, because I think people just backed away from equality, and I think that's the formal version of equality. And the equity piece, people sort of turned to that. I was working with a number of civil society groups, and they were starting to pick up the language of equity, and it was really troubling me. And I understood why, what bothered me most about it was this very formalistic understanding of equality. And even law contains another notion of equality that is substantive and that is not based on this, we all get the same number and that's equality. That's not equality at all. But substantive equality seems to have fallen by the wayside in law as well. So thanks very much for coming. So yeah, that was what was bothering me about equity. I think equity is a weak version. This is sort of a leftover, if you will. And that could be my legal training coming in. But I just saw it as the leftover, and this is sort of, okay, we're just going to avoid this whole equality conversation instead of insisting that there's something more to equality that needs to be taken on. And so this is my little attempt to take that on and to say there is something about equality that we need to talk about, and there is something in equality, and we need to reclaim that language. And that's partly what this project is about, is to say there's more to this. It's not just sameness. There's something else that's going on with equality. So it's an attempt to redefine it in the context of civil society, or reimagine it, I suppose, in the context of civil society. And maybe that's not a good enough reason to abandon equity. But for me, I just saw groups turning away from the idea of equality, and equity to me was always the kind of leftover. In law, it was this sort of leftover, weaker partner to equality, and I wanted to do something out of that, but not in law. So.
Okay, well, just one last question from my part. In the beginning of your presentation, you talked about your empirical material as existing studies and as cultural artifacts, and that's something that draws attention when we read your book, that we can see that you talk about real life experience, but also about films and fiction and so on. Could you talk a little bit about the challenge, the methodological challenges of looking at these two kinds of empirical material,
Sorry, Cameron. Oh, I messed it up again. Yeah, and I admit that the film part was really. There was another film that I didn't mention. I think it's called Where Do We Go Now? And by a Lebanese director, whose name I forget at the moment. But the film pieces and the novel pieces were more kind of how can I say, coming across things as the idea evolved. So it wasn't a systematic. And I'm not trained in film analysis, so it was more thinking about it. And then one night was having dinner with Winifred Sullivan, and she said, "Have you read Birds Without Wings?" And I was like, "No." So then I ran home and got the book, and I thought, "Oh, she was right." So there are many, many more. The chance, going to the Montreal Museum of Contemporary Art and seeing William Kentridge's work for the first time and going, who the heck is this guy and why haven't I known about him my whole life? And then, you know, kind of feeling really embarrassed about having dismissed animation for, you know, as a genre to do social critique. So those were the kind of challenges the challenge is systematic analysis, which I don't claim that it is. But I think the advantage of that is that you can insert your film, your book, and say, okay, I see that this might be useful in helping us think about this. And in my social context, this is what works. So I don't pretend to be comprehensive in it at all. And that is both an advantage and a disadvantage. I still can't possibly be comprehensive with novels and film anyhow. But there are definitely challenges, and I think the other challenge is that oftentimes as sociologists, there's like, she just picked the film she liked, and you know, it's open to that accusation, sure. But I think the films that I chose do the job that I wanted them to do, and I, you know, can't apologize for them. I can only say this is what I happened to see at the moment, or someone recommended, or as I was talking about this idea, they said, "Oh, this reminds me of this." And then, as I said, how did I do this? There were so many rabbit holes. It took me forever to do this, and you know, I would start writing, and then I would be happened to be at Bellagio, and I met a filmmaker who had done a film in Afghanistan. And then I had to wait for her to release her film to me so that I could watch it. And there is a piece that I talk about that film a little bit in the book. So these were just these wonderful pieces that help to add to the, you know, more legitimate, if you will, sociological data sets. And I really appreciated them and the voices that they brought to it in ways, and the imaginations that authors of fiction had and the filmmakers had to capture some of these things. I very much appreciate it. So I don't know if that answered your question, but.
I see we have no more questions. Unless of course there's one burning question. But otherwise, what's left is to thank you most sincerely, Laurie, for that beautiful talk you gave to us about deep equality. And of course, everyone for asking those very thoughtful questions. I heard you acknowledge that some of them were making you think more about the idea. And I think that's what this is really all about. So, from us as a collective, thank you, and to everyone, thank you so much for coming. And those online, thank you for attending. Until next year, it sounds like a long time away.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's when we'll have our next.
The next seminar is November.
Yes, there is a seminar, not a masterclass. Okay. So we have a seminar in November. So we hope to see most of you there. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Before I forget.